You see too much. You feel what no one else sees. This rare consciousness is a gift and a danger. Carl Jung revealed, looking beyond the surface can isolate you, exhaust your soul, and yet transform your life. The paradox? The more you perceive, the less the world understands you. Are you tired of superficiality, of fakeness? What if this pain is the beginning of a greater transformation? Get ready to discover how this intense vision can be the key to a purpose that few know. Are you ready to see the invisible and find your truth? There are people who look at the world and see far beyond what meets the eye. They have a kind of rare consciousness, a lens that reveals hidden details, emotional cracks, and invisible signs that most prefer to ignore. Carl Jung described this as a gaze that pierces through masks, capturing the deepest layers of the human inner world. But this gift doesn't come without costs. This constant vision of what others hide can lead to a state of permanent alertness, as if the individual carried a radar too sensitive for a noisy and superficial world. The most challenging part is realizing that often these truths cannot be undone or ignored. When you perceive so deeply, every encounter, every misinterpreted gesture, or every word spoken in the heat of the moment carries a different weight. It's a kind of involuntary emotional absorption, as if there were an invisible sponge collecting everything that's in the air. This perception, which some would call dangerous perception, transforms reality into a dense web of hidden information. It's not uncommon for people like this to experience spiritual exhaustion because the brain can't switch off. It's as if they carried collective pain along with their own. And what do you do when you see beyond? But the world insists on pretending nothing is happening. This is the seed of something much greater, the search for authenticity in a world that prefers masks. The individual begins to wonder, should I really keep feeling so much? Or, why does it seem like no one notices what I see? This restlessness is just the beginning of a deeper process, which Carl Jung would call individuation, the journey to become who you really are. But this path is far from simple and opens space for even more challenging questions about the loneliness and alienation that arise when intolerance to superficiality begins to become inevitable. And this leads us to the next point. Those who carry this rare consciousness soon discover that seeing beyond appearances can be an ambiguous gift. It's like watching a movie in slow motion while everyone else seems to live at an accelerated pace. Small signs, a diverted glance, a stuck word, reveal more than the surface allows. This dangerous perception unmasks hidden intentions and highlights the inconsistency between what people say and what they really feel. However, this can generate a sense of alienation because the world seems unable to bear so much clarity. And, ironically, the more you perceive, the harder it becomes to participate in common social interactions. It's at this point that social life begins to weigh heavy. Trivial conversations that for many are just pastime, for these individuals become an emotional minefield. It's almost impossible to fake interest in shallow talk when the mind is busy deciphering the emotions behind each word. This intolerance to superficiality creates a vacuum, pushing the individual away from social groups and even intimate relationships. They feel like someone trying to breathe in a room without air, and this constant search for depth inevitably generates spiritual exhaustion. The feeling is of carrying the world on their shoulders, even when no one seems to notice. Some try to ignore what they feel, diving into work or distractions, but this only worsens the internal division, a divided self fighting against its own nature. Others seek refuge in moments of silence or even in-depth psychology practices, trying to understand their own pain. But there's something these people don't yet realize. This extreme sensitivity, despite seeming like a burden, is preparing the ground for a crucial step. Because the more intolerance to superficiality grows, the more the need to protect authenticity arises, and this will lead them to make a decision that will change everything. There comes a moment when intolerance to superficiality stops being just discomfort and becomes a vital limit. Those who carry this rare consciousness begin to physically feel the impact of shallow interactions, as if each empty word drained their energy. It's at this point that isolation becomes almost inevitable. But it's not about a cowardly escape. It's an act of self-preservation. Maintaining authenticity in a world that insists on masks requires courage. And sometimes the only way to sustain it is to step away from the noise that tries to corrupt the essence. This isolation, however, doesn't come without pain. It creates a sense of alienation, of being a stranger in your own home. Many report silent nights when they wonder if they're wrong for wanting something deeper. But actually, this choice is an attempt to protect the inner world and avoid fragmentation of the divided self. Instead of getting lost in toxic relationships or empty conversations, they prefer conscious solitude, the kind that allows diving into themselves. And in this dive, they begin to realize that solitude can be a laboratory of transformation. Over time, practices emerge that help deal with this exhaustion. Some seek refuge in books that nourish the soul, like Carl Jung's The Red Book, or texts that explore depth psychology. Others create routines that privilege silence, outdoor walks, meditation, or even trips to places where nature is the main company. But this choice for isolation opens space for something unexpected. Because by stepping away from what hurts their authenticity, these people begin to perceive a hidden dynamic in the universe, something that transcends common logic. One of the most intense effects of rare consciousness is the ability to absorb others' emotions without realizing it. It's as if the boundaries of one's own being dissolved amid others' pain and anguish. This emotional absorption is so deep that often the person believes they're feeling something of their own, when in reality they're carrying invisible burdens that don't belong to them. This generates a silent spiritual exhaustion, which accumulates until the body and mind cry for help. And the worst part is that it's not always easy to identify where so much weight comes from. This phenomenon was called by Jung the mystique of participation, because it's as if the divided self intertwined with the collective unconscious. In everyday situations, this can be devastating. Imagine participating in a meeting and leaving with the feeling of having gone through a battle without having said a single word, or visiting a sad friend and upon returning home feeling emotionally drained. This extreme sensitivity can lead the individual to avoid social encounters, not out of coldness, but out of pure self-preservation. However, isolation doesn't always solve the problem because the absorbed emotions still remain trapped in the body. Some learn to relieve this weight through practices that restore balance, like writing about what they feel, walking in contact with nature, or diving into depth psychology readings that explain the phenomenon. Carl Jung's Memories, Dreams, and Reflections is an example. Others create silence rituals at the end of the day, turning off electronic devices and reconnecting with their own inner world. But even with these precautions, the feeling of carrying others' pain remains, and this prepares the ground for a new challenge: the need to create masks to survive in an environment that demands constant functionality. When the intensity of emotional absorption and intolerance to superficiality becomes unbearable, an almost instinctive mechanism emerges, creating masks. The individual begins to fragment their divided self into pieces that fit each environment. It's a silent process of adaptation, but also of wear. They laugh when they don't want to laugh, agree when they don't agree, and little by little authenticity gets buried under a performance that only serves to fit in. In the short term, it works, but in the long term, it undermines the soul. This fragmentation generates clear symptoms: chronic fatigue, anxiety, apathy, an emptiness that's hard to explain. It's as if life had transformed into a stage where each interaction requires disproportionate effort. People who live like this often report that when they get home, they feel emotionally exhausted, as if they had lived several lives in a single day. It's a high price to pay for trying to keep up appearances, and the worst part is that often they themselves no longer know who they really are. To relieve this pressure, some seek refuge in therapies, especially those that work with depth psychology, trying to rescue contact with the inner world. Others find creative escapes, painting, writing, playing an instrument, any activity that allows the sacred wound to express itself. But even though these strategies help, the feeling of incompleteness remains. It's in this state of fragmentation that unexpectedly something magical can happen, a rare encounter that seems to have been written by the universe itself, capable of bringing relief and meaning through a connection impossible to explain. Amid loneliness and the feeling of alienation, there are rare moments that change everything, encounters that seem orchestrated by the universe itself. Carl Jung called this synchronicity, when individuals with the same frequency meet and instantly recognize each other. It's as if the soul said, "I know who you are," without a word needing to be spoken. This phenomenon transcends common logic and brings a deep sense of validation and belonging, something these people have often waited their entire lives to feel. These connections can arise anywhere: a cafe, an unexpected conversation, or even a glance exchanged in silence. But when they happen, they break the cycle of spiritual exhaustion and remind the individual that they're not alone. Finding another person who also carries this rare consciousness is like finally breathing after a long time submerged. This genuine exchange allows both to be entirely authentic, without the need for masks or defenses against the world's intolerance to superficiality. More than individual encounters, synchronicity awakens the understanding that authentic relationships and community are vital. These are the bonds that sustain rare souls in an environment that frequently misunderstands them. That's why many seek to create groups or support circles where they can share deep experiences without fear of judgment. This sense of community becomes a living reminder that there's a cosmic purpose guiding each step, a calling that begins to reveal itself more clearly from this point in the journey. With the strength that synchronicity brings, the individual begins to realize that their journey isn't just about surviving the external world. There's something greater, a cosmic purpose that goes far beyond personal success or material achievements. People with this rare consciousness understand that each wound, each experience of alienation, and each moment of spiritual exhaustion carries a function to prepare the ground for something transformative. They're not here to accumulate applause, but to generate change, even if silent, in others' lives. This calling isn't easy. It requires the person to transmute their own pain into tools for collective healing. It's as if the universe had chosen them to integrate realities that seem opposite: light and shadow, joy and suffering, individual and collective. This process resembles Carl Jung's Individuation, the deep dive into the inner world that allows emerging more whole and true. But this isn't limited to an isolated spiritual path. On the contrary, this mission is only fulfilled when real impact is created, whether through words, actions, or presence. Examples abound. Think of people who, even without great visibility, transform the lives of those around them. Teachers who awaken talents, volunteers who offer support to strangers, or even those who share their stories and inspire authenticity. This perception completely changes how you see your own trajectory. Pain, previously felt as punishment, begins to be seen as a sacred wound, full of wisdom. And it's from this understanding that the next step emerges, accepting that internal marks aren't weaknesses, but inexhaustible sources of power. The deepest marks, those that often arose in childhood, carry a force that few recognize. This sacred wound is the silent core of rare consciousness, a space where pain and extreme sensitivity meet. It's easy to see these experiences as weaknesses, but actually, they hide an immense power of transformation. Carl Jung said that it's precisely in wounds that light enters, and this process isn't just poetic, it defines the path to true individuation, the integration of everything we were, are, and can be. Understanding this changes the relationship with your own story. Instead of denying or burying suffering, the individual begins to look at it as a source of learning. It's as if each scar carried a key to access unique gifts, talents that are born from lived experience. People who went through challenging situations, like rejection or significant losses, often develop rare empathy, an ability to genuinely connect with others. But this strength only reveals itself when authenticity stops being an option and becomes a commitment. This process, however, isn't immediate. It requires time, patience, and courage to revisit painful memories and understand the patterns that repeat. Some people find support in depth psychology therapies, while others turn to writing, art, or spiritual practices that favor contact with the inner world. But regardless of the chosen path, something becomes clear. By integrating this wound, the person not only finds meaning for their own journey, but becomes capable of guiding others. And it's precisely this acceptance that opens the door to the next step. There comes a point when hiding who you really are stops being possible. After recognizing the strength contained in the sacred wound, the need emerges to embrace authenticity fully. It's an act of courage because the world often rewards those who adapt, not those who expose themselves. But those who carry this rare consciousness understand that denying their own essence is the fastest path to spiritual exhaustion. And this acceptance isn't just internal, it reflects in daily choices that begin to align the inner world with external life. This change transforms how the person relates to the world. Instead of seeking approval, they begin to seek coherence. This can mean saying no more often, leaving toxic environments, or even changing professions to align work and purpose. People who experience this transition report a feeling of relief, as if they were finally breathing fresh air. It's a fundamental step in the individuation process, that moment when the divided self begins to integrate. But at the same time, this choice can cause ruptures in old relationships, which requires even more strength. Practical examples show the power of this empowerment. Imagine someone who always molded themselves to please family and decides to pursue an artistic career, even without support. Or someone who lived in abusive relationships and finally breaks free, choosing to be alone for a while. These decisions aren't simple, but they completely change quality of life. And as authenticity flourishes, something greater begins to form, an invisible community of people who share the same search for depth. It's this collective encounter that will give even more meaning to the journey. Those who walk the path of rare consciousness know that, despite necessary isolation, prolonged loneliness can be poison for the soul. That's why meeting a community of similar souls is vital. These groups aren't simple social circles, but true spaces of welcome, where intolerance to superficiality is understood and respected. There, authenticity isn't just accepted, but celebrated, and each story is an invitation to collective transformation, an essential step toward a world that yearns for more meaning. This communion strengthens, welcomes, and amplifies the purpose of those who feel out of place amid the masses. There, the feeling of alienation gives way to belonging, and each person's sacred wounds transform into shared sources of power and wisdom. People who experienced the pain of isolation find in the collective the strength to move forward, keeping alive the flame of individuation and the awakening of rare consciousness. This union is the remedy against spiritual exhaustion and the antidote to the superficiality that suffocates the soul. If this path resonates with you, it's time to stop hiding and connect. Finding this tribe is an act of courage, a step toward a truer and fuller life. You're not alone in this journey, and there's room for everyone who chose authenticity instead of masks. The journey continues, and with it, the promise of a greater purpose, where each rare soul contributes to the collective healing and evolution of the planet. And thus, personal transformation becomes a movement that transcends borders. Now that you've dove into this journey through rare consciousness, it's time to reflect. How can this vision transform your daily life? Are you willing to recognize your wounds and use this strength to awaken deep authenticity? What part of your inner world have you been avoiding exploring? Remember, change begins when we stop running from what challenges us most. What will you do differently tomorrow to honor your truth and free yourself from spiritual exhaustion? If this content touched you, subscribe to the channel and activate notifications to continue following this transformation journey. Here, you find not just knowledge, but connection with a community that values depth and authenticity. Don't miss the next video, which is on the end screen, to take another step toward your purpose. We're together in this walk toward individuation,